Okay, now we're going to start talking about financial assets. I'm going to break this up into a lot of smaller videos because this is kind of a big section here, and a lot of the information is pretty important. So right now we're just going to go over overview of financial assets, and then we're going to talk specifically about loans. Um, Bonds are a bigger one. Bonds and stocks are going to take a little bit more time. All right, so different types of financial assets we need to know for this course. Loans, pretty straightforward actually, probably one of the easier ones, but they're kind of the basis for the rest of them, so we have to go through all those concepts. Um, Bonds, stocks, bank deposits. Each type will have its own pros and cons, usually weighed by transaction costs, risk, and liquidity. And transaction costs are pretty straightforward. You should have, so each one of these things, they check these boxes differently, and you need to know how they all work with these differently. So we're going to go through these all step by step. But transaction costs are pretty straightforward. The cost of getting whatever asset it is. Um, some are high. Some actually have like physical, like actual value-based costs. Some are just costs and time, right? How easy it is to get the financial asset or to make it liquid, right? And those are transaction costs. Risk we'll talk about here in a second. Liquidity, how easy it is to turn it into something that you can use in transactions. You probably can figure this out already on your own, but like bank deposits and loans are fairly liquid. Loans will give you liquidity, but bonds and stocks are slightly less so. They are moving away and becoming more illiquid. So, cash obviously, but then loans and bank deposits are more liquid. Bonds and stocks less so. Risk. Let's talk about risk here in a second for a little bit. Risk is the chance of loss or growth. Um, it's usually going to be closely tied to interest rates, but it's also return on investment. We'll talk more about how all of these have different levels of risk involved. And if you ever talk to a financial planner, one of the big things they're going to talk, one of the first things they'll probably ask you is, what's your level of risk? How risk adverse are you or comfortable you are with risk? High risk, high reward, but high risk means also high chance of losing everything, right? Low risk, lower reward. You'll still, hopefully be beating inflation, but low risk investments usually you're not going to, become a billionaire or anything like that. High risk, you have a chance of, investing in Microsoft in, whenever, with the 70s or 80s when they formed as a company. And if you did that, it was a high risk because you never knew if this Microsoft company will take off. You could have lost all of your money. You could have lost all your investment money. Super high risk, but for some people, they became millionaires by the age of 30, right? So high risk, high reward, also a good high chance of losing everything. Anyways, how risk tolerant? These all have different varying levels of risk. All right. So a loan, you know what a loan is. A lot of you are going to college probably someday, or you're thinking about it, or maybe you want to buy a car or a house. These are all reasons why we get loans or a boat. I don't know. There's 1,000 reasons. Business loans, there's a lot of reasons why people might get a loan. Essentially, you get a loan because you need cash. You need liquidity for whatever reason. You don't have cash, you need cash. And so loans are great for liquidity. They basically give you cash, which then you can use for transactions. Some of them are tied to certain things, right? So college especially has like special interest rates for that. Sometimes come from government-backed institutions. Cars, houses, there's all, mortgages, those are special types of loans. So they're great for liquidity. Sometimes they're tied to certain things. Sometimes it's just, I need $5,000 for the reasons, and you can get it as long as you can get a bank to give it to you. Usually low risk for both parties. Why is that? Uh, Loans can be high risk, I guess, but you're less likely to get one. So think about it. When you get a loan, the thing that determines your loan is your credit report, right? Your background check, essentially, your credit score. And that's going to determine whether or not you can get a loan, whether or not you can get credit, essentially. And so, because you have a credit report number, you have a credit score number, a lending institution looks at it real quick and they can decide whether or not they're going to give you a loan. They may give you a loan if they consider you to be a higher risk person. However, your interest rate is going to be higher. They are not going to give you a loan at a low risk interest rate because they are worried about losing their money. A lot of times when we think about financial assets, we only think about it from the consumer's point of view. You have to switch around and think about it too from the business's point of view. If I sell cars and somebody comes into my establishment and they want to buy a car, I want to sell them that car, obviously, but I'm not going to give them a loan if they're not going to repay it. And the only way I might possibly give them a loan is if I look at their credit score and say, they're probably going to pay me back, but I'm going to have to charge them a large amount of interest, which they're going to pay up front. And they're going to pay those first, their monthly payments. and I'm going to get that interest. I'm going to get that money up front. I'm going to get a large amount from them. Otherwise, I'm going to walk away. I'm not going to sell them this car at all. Now, somebody who comes in and they have a very stable credit score, you know they're going to pay off that car. You know they're going to pay it back. You're going to give them a lower interest rate. They're a lower risk. You're going to make the money off of them by selling the car. You're going to make money off of them by charging interest. Um, there's no reason to gouge them. They're a low risk investment. So low risk, low reward. Anyways, of course, there's some places that are predatory too. They go after poorer people for these reasons and charge exorbitant rates. Think like credit, payday loan places and stuff. All right. So, anyways, usually low risk for both parties. So loans are fairly low risk. Like you just don't get a loan if you're super high risk. It's just you're out of the system. Bad credit, no credit, you might have a problem. Anyways, however, transaction costs. Loans have some heavy transaction costs. Sometimes, if you ever want to buy a house and you need to get a mortgage, ask your parents about it. There actually are costs involved with getting a mortgage, like financial costs. Then also time. Loans, unless it's maybe like a payday place, but most loans are going to take a little while. They have to do a background check, a credit check. There's paperwork involved. Bigger loans, there might even be lawyers involved, so it's a little bit more complicated. So there's more transaction costs with loans. Also, they are getting very wildly in terms of interest rates and credit histories and what kinds of loans. Next thing, and this is kind of an interesting part with loans, and a lot of people don't know this. Loans can be bought and sold by the asset holder. So think what an asset is. An asset is something that you have, right? Either physical or financial. It's something you have that is valued. Um, and that, so if I say I'm a bank and I own your mortgage, right? I have an asset. That is something that is worth something. Because I know every month, I know it seems weird because it's like you gave that money away, but every month, somebody is going to be paying me money back on that mortgage. So it is a type of asset. It's like an investment, basically. I can sell that asset to another bank, right? If I own your mortgage, let's say, let's just remove mortgage from it. Let's say you owe somebody $100, and somebody else says, hey, I owe you $100. I'll pay you, back $100 with interest. And by next year, I'll pay you $150 or something like that. So, that right now, let's say, I own your debt. You owe me $100. By next year, you will pay me $150. Hopefully, this makes sense. I can then say, hey, okay, every month you're paying me $10 or whatever. Every month you're paying me $15, whatever. You're paying me back slightly monthly amount of money, but I need cash right now. I can go to somebody else, another bank or another person essentially, and say, hey, this guy owes me money. How about I give you that debt, basically, like I give you this asset, and he's going to pay you back now if you give me $100 today, right? So it's worth $150. He's going to pay you back $150 total next year. I need $100 right now, so I'm going to give you this, sell this asset to you. So you give me $100, now somebody else owns that debt. This is weird, but this happens a lot. Ask your parents. Most likely when they got a mortgage, that mortgage was then sold to another company. They usually get a letter in the mail. It may or may not change who they send their mortgage payment to every month because somebody else buys that debt and then they hold that debt as an asset. This happens a lot. This actually happens all the time. Hopefully that didn't get too confusing. The asset is what you have, all right, the bank has. It's a liability to whoever is paying it back off. So whoever's paying it back. So loans can be bought and sold after they are established. So after you've done the transaction costs, you've done the credit checks, you've done all the paperwork, now there's a loan in existence. It's an asset for, be quiet, kitty. It's an asset for the bank. It is a liability to whoever's paying it back. However, if you're buying and selling loans, you should scrutinize them and know what you're actually buying. We didn't before, and this is going to be one of the contributors to the 2008 financial crisis, right? So, because imagine, let's say you buy a loan from somebody, and they said, oh yeah, we did all the background checks, and we did all the, looking at the credit checks and looked into everybody's financial stuff, and then you get that loan and that person doesn't pay it back, right? They're a deadbeat. They don't pay back their mortgage. They don't pay back their car payments or whatever. Well, now you're stuck. You just bought a loan thinking that you were going to be getting monthly payments, thinking that you were going to be getting interest, and now you lose everything. You've lost your investment. And you're like, well, it would never happen. It totally did. What made it worse is that a lot of mortgages were grouped together. So 10 years ago, 12 years ago, a lot of banks were giving out what were called ninja loans. loans that were given to people with no income, no jobs, and no assets. Ninja. I know there's an extra N in there. I didn't make the acronym. So, anyways, Ninja loans were given to people who shouldn't have gotten house loans, shouldn't have gotten mortgages, but they were given to people who should not have been getting the loans. Anyways, then these things were grouped together into big securities, basically just groups of mortgages, and sold, and people were buying parts of these securities and investing into them. It got really weird and confusing. It was sold, some of these mortgage, groups, these big pools of mortgages were sold to people overseas in China and Europe, all around the world. And then when those people who couldn't pay off their loans because they didn't have any jobs, they didn't have money, they didn't have a reason to have a mortgage, they lost everything, then the entire mortgage crisis became global because people weren't paying attention to what they were buying and selling. So be careful with that. Loans, buying and selling, this is something to be aware of. This is part of the reason why the Great Recession went global, because people can buy and sell. They weren't looking at what they were buying and selling that closely.